And now it's time for another Dice Tower review with Mike Vincent.
Hello, Michael Vincent here, and today I'm very excited to do an educational review of a game called Twilight Struggle. Now, I've taught 3 senior history courses, and for all 3 of those courses, the Cold War is a very significant portion. It's often a very long unit. There's a lot of complex events and theories and concepts in the Cold War. And so when I heard about this game called Twilight Struggle, which is essentially the Cold War in a box, I was thrilled. So much so that I thought I would don my history teacher by day, gamer by night tie, just to celebrate this fantastic game, Twilight Struggle. So I'm going to go through, again, the point of this video is not to teach you the game, but simply to go through. I want to look at the objective, the components, the theme, and then finally wrap up with the educational value of this game. So let's jump in and take a look at this excellent Cold War game called Twilight Struggle. Okay, so here we see the board for Twilight Struggle. Now, Twilight Struggle is a card-based strategy game developed by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews and produced by GMT Games. So, of course, the Cold War is a global conflict, and this game does an excellent job of portraying that. So we have all the continents, and you have the USSR and the USA competing to control different countries all over the world. Now, there are battleground countries that are more significant than others, and so the communists are trying to spread communism all over the world by attempting coups, starting wars, and they have all the different events that may have been significant for the USSR. And the USA, of course, then is trying to spread their capitalist influence, spreading democracy, trying to put down communist uprisings, and spread their influence as much as possible. So there are 3 potential ways you can win Twilight Struggle, and I'd like to quickly highlight each one and just walk you through how it's possible to win or lose this game. Okay, so the first way to win Twilight Struggle is through victory points. So there's different cards you can play that will score you victory points. There's scoring cards that, depending on how much influence you have in a continent, you'll end up getting points. So throughout the game, each player is trying to score victory points, but unlike other games where perhaps it's a race to the finish to acquire a certain amount, in Twilight Struggle, and very appropriate given the theme of the Cold War, it's this sort of back and forth tug of war. So if I'm the USSR player, I might start going up, scoring victory points for perhaps winning wars, like I might win the Korean War and gain victory points, or perhaps I'll play a scoring card and I have lots of influence in Asia and I'll go up scoring points. But then the USA, well, perhaps they will win a war and they will gain victory points and they will start to take away from the amount of victory points I have as the USSR. So both players, it's sort of this tug of war where you have to have 20 victory points more than your opponent. So you start at 0, and if the Americans are able to accrue enough victory points to make it to 20, they win. And if the Russians are able to pull back and perhaps finally they get to 20, then they win. So that's one way you can try and win this game, is through scoring of victory points. So the second way you can win in Twilight Struggle is through controlling Europe. So of course, after World War II, or at the end of World War II, you have the Americans and the Allies, and they're pushing their way through Western Europe. You have Stalin and the Russians from the USSR, and they're both squeezing the Nazis, and they meet in Germany, and so the Russians have control of Eastern Europe. The Allied powers in the USA have control of Western Europe, and so Europe is very important geographically and politically for the Cold War. So unlike other continents where you can potentially score points for controlling them, you will actually win the game if you manage to control Europe. Now, of course, this is easier said than done. This is a primary battleground for both players, playing cards to try and flip countries' control in Europe. But if you are able to control Europe and score the board, then you will end up winning the game by controlling Europe. And finally, well, what would a Cold War game be without the potential for nuclear war? So the DEFCON status is very important in this game. And if you start trying to overthrow other countries by instigating coups, or if you start declaring wars, perhaps you start the Korean War, and your country starts to increase their military operations, well, every time they make it to 5, this will decrease the DEFCON status. So it starts at 5 with peace, but as wars occur, as you're playing cards that are aggressive, or if coups are happening, this will continue to drop. And so if the DEFCON level happens to make it to 1, This will trigger nuclear war, and the player who triggered the nuclear war will be the loser. So perhaps you're able to play cards in such a way that you can trip your opponent into starting a nuclear war. Well, in that case, you will win the game, and the person who started the nuclear war will lose. So 3 ways: 1, through scoring victory points; 2, through controlling the very important continent Europe; and 3, triggering nuclear war through the DEFCON status, reaching DEFCON 1. So the most significant component of this game is certainly the board. I love the board. It's very big. It takes up a lot of room, but it's very colorful and very functional. They've put the sequence of play in the corners. You can always see what you have to do next. They have the different flags for the USSR and the USA, which is a nice little touch. You can keep track of the action rounds. You can keep track of the DEFCON status and the military operations. We see the victory points track is tracked on the board, and it's very easy to see the different countries and know who controls what. So there's different colored chits. So if you control a country completely, you have the dark side of the chit. But if you flip it over, if you just have a presence there but you don't control it, then you see the light side of the chit. So let's take a deeper look at some of the more finer components. So other than the board, there's not too many different types of components, but mainly we're looking at different types of chits, and we're looking at 3 decks of cards. One thing I really like about this game is that there's 3 decks of cards, 1 for the early war, 1 for the mid-war, and finally 1 for the late war. Now this is nice both from a gameplay perspective and from an educational perspective. From a gameplay perspective, it's nice to have fresh cards as you play through the game, so the events you're using at the beginning of the game are going to be completely different than the events you're playing at the end of the game. So this keeps the game fresh, and so as you're playing through, the game is evolving and changing. Now this is also nice educationally because chronologically, the events that happened in the beginning of the Cold War are represented in the early war. And of course, as we go on, the mid-war and the late war, it's chronologically going through the events of the Cold War. And so if a student is playing this game, they're going to notice that they're going to start to associate certain events with the beginning of the Cold War, the middle of the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War. And so chronology and knowing dates is very important in history. And so if a student is able to, in their mind, conceive of when events happened, while they're at the beginning, the middle, the end of the Cold War, then I think that's really going to help them have just a better understanding of the Cold War as a whole. We have 2 dice, which are used a few times in the game, pretty basic, and the chits are nothing special, but they certainly get the job done. Just little cardboard chits. I do like that they're double-sided, so again, if you have presence in a country, you're going to have it to the light side, and as soon as you control, well, you just flip it over and it's the dark side. Another nice thing they've included is these little marker chits. So when you're playing certain cards that maybe have a lasting effect on the board, instead of having to remember that, well, then you can just keep track with these little chits as you lay them down. So the components are nothing to write home about. I don't think they're fantastic, and there's nothing here that really stands out as like a super cool component, but certainly the chits in the cards are very functional, and I do like how they've divvied up the cards between the early war, the mid-war, and the late war. The last element component-wise that I wanted to touch on is they do include 2 inserts for each player. My wife and I, when we first started playing this game, did find that it was a bit tricky to keep track of all the little rules in this game. The gameplay is very smooth once you learn it, but it is a bit intimidating when you first start playing as there are a lot of different rules. So having these player aids where we could quickly look and see how a coup works or how a realignment works was very handy. So kudos to GMT for including these 2 player aid cards. Whether you're playing by yourself or with friends, or whether you're using this with students, it's never a bad thing to have a nice little player aid there just to make the game run more smoothly. So really appreciated these 2 player aids. So now touching on theme, I think this game has done a fantastic job of capturing the theme of the Cold War. Simple things like the turn tracker or the space race track, they could have simply had little numbers where you move the turn track up and down, but they have each turn represented by a different leader from the Cold War. So for the early war, we have Stalin and Truman, and at the end of the war, of course, we have Reagan and Gorbachev. So both educationally and thematically, this is very cool because you get to see which leaders were associated with which different part of the Cold War chronologically, and they have all the big players in there: Nixon, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Truman, Stalin, Reagan, Khrushchev. They're all in there, which is really cool. So I like that element. The space race, they have little pictures highlighting some of the major events of the space race. And so there's a lot of things they've done to this game to really just make the theme stand out and make it feel like you are part of the Cold War and you're playing through the events of the Cold War. So I also feel the cards do a very good job of portraying that theme of the Cold War. There's everything you can imagine from the Cold War packed into this game. So whether we're talking about important people like Che Guevara or the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, we have important events from the Cold War, whether it's the Cultural Revolution in China or the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have conflicts from Vietnam to the Korean War, and some of the important treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty or the Marshall Plan. All these cards have pictures from the different events and the different leaders on them, and so you really feel like if you are a fan of the Cold War, if you studied the Cold War, you're going to recognize so many of the different events, people, conflicts, treaties, and they're all in here with pictures, and you really feel like when you're going back and forth, you're attempting coups, you're overthrowing countries, and you're going back and forth. And one thing they've really done well, which helps marry the mechanics of the game with the theme of the game, is this sort of tug of war. Whether it's with victory points or whether you're going back and forth trying to control a country, they've really got that back and forth, very competitive tug of war theme that just goes throughout the entire game. So excellent job in this game in portraying the theme of the Cold War. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about the educational value of this game. And I have to say, I can't imagine how you would almost come up with a better game about the Cold War that has so much information packed into it. So what you're seeing here is my textbook from one of my history courses, and this is sort of the chapter overview with a bit of a study guide of terms. So I went through and highlighted every term that was directly referenced in this game. Now, a lot of these events that aren't highlighted actually do tie in with the events of the game, though not directly referenced in some of the cards. So, and in some cases, some of the cards actually went into more detail than the textbook. So here you can see the first chapter in the Cold War, all of these blue highlighting representing the different terms. And as well for this chapter, as the Cold War has split into two chapters for this course, having other terms. And so many of these ones, though not highlighted, do tie in with the events of the game. So this could be a perfect way for students who are enthusiastic about gaming and who really like the Cold War to review for a test at the end of the unit, or just to further their understanding and cement a lot of the concepts and people and events and treaties from the war. So I think this game is fantastic in terms of its historical value. Now I also want to take a look at a very important element of the rule book. So I was thrilled when I started reading through rules and noticed at the back of the book they actually have card histories. So for every card in the game, they've gone through and talked about the history behind that event. And there are pages and pages of the history that ties in. So for a student who's playing this game, if they draw a card and it's with an event of something they perhaps don't have a full understanding of, they can flip to the back of the book and very quickly have a pretty good understanding of that event. In addition, you could perhaps design a project where students had to write their own card histories. So they could choose the USA side or the USSR side, perhaps take the early war cards or the late war cards, and then go ahead and write some histories on the background of that card. Or perhaps they could look at the mechanics and try to explain why does this card function mechanically in the game, and how does that tie into the historical event that's being featured on the card. So I think if you got creative, you could do some really neat things with the different elements. Now I've only just got this game in the last few months, and I'll be teaching the Cold War later on this year, and so I'm certainly planning to use this game and offer it as an option for some students who I know are enthusiastic about games to try and make some little projects and further their understanding of the Cold War. So of course, anytime you're dealing with a world map, students are automatically going to be learning geography, but this game goes one step further and actually marries the importance of geopolitics. So how come certain countries have higher values, and why is that? And so for example, we see with certain countries, if they have a red box, that means it's a battleground state, as to a box with a yellow. So perhaps you could design a small assignment where students had to look at Italy or France or Libya or Egypt as a battleground state and say, okay, well, let's do some further research and look at why these countries are battleground states. Why is Israel considered to be a battleground state and not Lebanon? So you could very quickly start to come up with some pretty clever ways to get students to look in and explore how does this game use geopolitics, and how can you look into it to perhaps do some further research. So I think it's really cool, and if students play this game a couple of times, they're going to have a very good understanding of which countries and which territories were significant for the Cold War, as opposed to other countries which were perhaps less significant. So let's look at North and South Korea. How come they're battleground states? Or let's look at Cuba. Why was that a battleground state? And so I think between the cards, the world, the geography, the value of the geopolitics of different regions. When you look at the turn track with the chronology, starting with Stalin and Truman and moving on at the end to Gorbachev and Reagan, if students play this game a few times, they're going to have a really good idea of both the chronology and the most important events and concepts from the Cold War. So there you have Twilight Struggle. That is a brief overview of the game, highlighting how you win, the components, and looking at the educational value of the game. Now, I think this game is fantastic, and I'm so excited that a game like this actually exists. In my opinion, this game integrates historical content and concepts into the mechanics and the theme of the game probably better than any game I've seen so far. Now, I do have quite a backlog of educational games that I still need to go through and play, so perhaps I will change that opinion later. But for right now, I am super impressed with how Twilight Struggle takes the events that I teach in my curriculum and really marries it to the theme and mechanics of this game. So I highly recommend, if you're a teacher and you teach senior history courses that focus on the Cold War, this is certainly something you want to consider taking a look at. Or if you're a parent and your son or daughter is really into the Cold War, if they're taking a senior history course focusing on 20th century history, then Twilight Struggle is certainly one to look at. It's very easy to play. The game is not too long, probably playing between an hour and 2 hours. Two weaknesses though, it is a two-player game. It's possible you could have students play in teams, but it's a bit exclusive in that it's meant for one-on-one. And I do think the rules do seem a bit intimidating at first. However, once you learn them, if you know the rules and you teach it to students, it actually plays pretty smoothly once you play through it a couple of times. So I think Twilight Struggle is certainly something to be used in a classroom to help supplement a Cold War unit. You could perhaps create some little projects around students, perhaps looking at card histories and writing their own card histories, or looking at why certain countries are battleground states and doing further research on that. So there's some opportunities to create projects, or simply to include in an after-school game club, or to invite students who you know like games and like the Cold War to help further their knowledge and just really take an extra bit of interest in the Cold War. So not only is Twilight Struggle a very solid game educationally, an amazing game educationally, at the time of this recording, it's actually the #1 ranked game on BoardGameGeek.com. Now, I'm not necessarily going to say this is the best game of all time, but it certainly speaks to this also being a well-designed game that is fun, in addition to being very historically immersing. And so as an educator, I give this 2 solid thumbs up. Twilight Struggle, an amazing game about the Cold War. Check it out. And if you're a teacher, make sure you get this for your classroom if you teach the Cold War.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.